In this series, I'm going to show you how I taught myself website coding and turned it into a viable business. If you're already running a business and want to make use of the internet to advertise your services or sell your products without being ripped off by all the sharks trying to scam you to build a website or to get your company to the top of the search listings, then this series of videos is for you. Definitely for you. So whether you're just curious about all things internet, setting up a new business, or struggling to cut through all the lies surrounding internet services, then stay tuned. Over the years, I've noticed that really clever people can be the worst at explaining things. That's because they assume that everyone knows the basic starting point. I've listened to university lecturers and YouTubers on many subjects, and they so often start their explanations partway through the topic, and so I never quite understand what they're on about subsequently to their lecture. Let's see if I can make an improvement on that. Many people have a website they've purchased, maybe at some expense, and in most cases it's not achieving very much. Think about your website as being at the hub of a range of other interconnecting activities. When I started learning website building, I was in a hurry to get going, and I guess you are as well. So I'm going to explain a few basics in this video, and in the next video we will work backwards, starting from a finished site and reverse engineering it, a bit like the Americans are doing with their captured alien flying saucers. Everything I'm doing in this video is done on a desktop PC that my little company makes. Last year I switched to an operating system called Linux because I was so fed up at being messed around by Microsoft Windows. So I talk and demonstrate more about Linux in a parallel series of videos. Check out the index to the library on my YouTube for more information on this. In order to write HTML code, you need a text editor. For years I've used a program or an application, depending on your point of view, called Notepad++. Since I switched to Linux, I use a program called Geany, spelled G-E-A-N-Y, just to be different. Both programs look similar and you can use either, and both of them come in versions that you can tweak to your own set of colors and preferences. There are numerous text editors on the market, some free, some that you have to pay for. I make it a point in all the things that I choose to do that I go for the simplest option over which I have the most control. So many times I've downloaded a program and it's just too complicated to bother with. So first, if you're working on Windows or Apple PCs, download the No Frills Notepad++ or Geany. If you're on a Linux computer, then Geany will be in the Linux repository and you can download it from there. And again, there's more info on the Linux section of my YouTube site. You may want to pause while you download and install one of these two text editors at this point. I'm going to dive into the code now. It looks daunting at first, certainly did when I first looked at it. I promise you that by the end of video 2 it will all seem quite straightforward. Of necessity, much of this video has been about setting out the groundwork. In the next video we will really get into the nuts and bolts of the website building, and then later we'll move on to all the other internet stuff that is deliberately shrouded in secrecy so that all the unscrupulous companies can make money from you and charge you the earth with advertising, SEO and all that other mush. A minute ago we looked at where the website fits into the general structure of hosting and finding the website on the internet and so on. I'll just briefly mention this. We're going to build a website and we're going to need a text editor. When we've built the website is going to sit on a domain, and the domain is your internet address. It's like your street number, your house number, it's like your head office on the internet. Once you have a domain, you then have to host it, and when you have a domain, not only can you put your website on it, but you can host your own email and lots of other things. So that's where we're going. The next thing you have to hold in your head are these three different pages. The browser is the thing that shows your website and everything else on the internet, and that might be Chrome, or it might be Firefox or Opera, or any one of a number of browsers now. Samsung make their own browser, though I've never used it. In order for things to show on the browser, you have to write HTML code, and very briefly I showed you the HTML code earlier. The HTML is the instructions as to what the browser is going to display, and the HTML contains the words defining the structure of the website, and it also links to your images and graphics and a few other things. But if the HTML is a language, the CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheet, but that really doesn't matter, the CSS is the dictionary. If you have a word, let's say a word in the English language, from time to time you'll want to look up its exact meaning and you'll go to a dictionary. So if you imagine the CSS as a dictionary, it defines the words in the HTML that will activate the browser. So that's the sequence of events, and we have to hold all of these things on the screen and in our heads together. Right. Let's now open up. I'm using Genie. You can use Notepad++, and there are a number of other paid for and free text editors. I'm using a version of Genie that I have changed into a black background. The default version of Genie and the default version of Notepad will look like that, and you might be very happy with that. Both Genie and Notepad have ways of changing the appearance. I'm not going to go into that now, but that is on another video. Right, let's get this thing about HTML text started, because that's the thing that is going to worry a lot of people. This is how a typical website will begin. I should point out, in all of this, this is the way I use HTML. If you like, it's my version, and it's the version I've taught myself. There will be a lot of people who say, that isn't right, we do it a different way, it can be done better. I've chosen the simplest way, and it gets results. So the page starts with doc.html, so we're telling the browser that the language that follows is HTML. And you'll see it's got little triangular brackets there, and at the bottom of the page the HTML has been closed. It's in a triangular bracket, but with this slash at the beginning. So the slash indicates a closure of the HTML. Then under the doc type and the HTML, there is another head, another tag in triangular brackets, which says head, and the head is open there, and you can see the head is closed there. Let me make this a little bit bigger. There we go. For the time being, we're not going to bother about any of this stuff in the head. It is explained in another video. We're looking more at the HTML design of the website rather than the technicalities of how the actual website transfers into a browser. So having showed you all of that, I'm going to ignore it. Let's go down here now to wrapper. The wrapper is like saying the page size. If you're writing on ordinary paper, you'll probably be using A4 or A5. So the wrapper defines the size of the page that we're going to work with. The wrapper has been opened here. It says div class wrapper in the triangular brackets, and down here you can see it's been closed with the slash div. So the open div always matches the closing div. This little bit of writing here is just an aide memoire. If you write triangular bracket, exclamation mark, dash dash, you can put a little message in here to remind yourself what's going on, which is essential when these web pages get long and complicated. So that little piece of text there is just a bit of aide memoire. Let's now, okay, so this says div class wrapper. What does that mean? Well, we now have to go to the CSS. And here is the CSS page that I mentioned that has to be read in conjunction with the HTML. As before, we're going to ignore all the preamble all the way down to wrapper. We will discuss it in a later video. Let's go to wrapper, which is our page size. The size of the page, let's jump into the text here. The size of the page is 100%. 100% of what? Well, it's 100% of the viewer's screen. Screens come in all different shapes and sizes these days, didn't used to. In the old days, in the 1990s, a screen size was 800 pixels by 800 pixels, and that was it. Today, they can be almost any size. So it's going to be 100% of any size of the viewer's device. But under no circumstance is it going to be bigger, wider than 1920 pixels. That's what that pix means. So what this means is if you have a big screen with a resolution of say 3000 pixels, the wrapper will only allow your website to be 1920 pixels wide. In other words, there's, if you take 2000 from 3000, there's roughly 1000 pixels going spare. So in round figures, there would be a gap on either side of the screen, a little margin, 500 pixels on one side, 500 pixels on the other. The reason for limiting the size of the page is that when you space everything out and it looks fine, if you allow it just to go bigger and bigger and bigger and explode, little by little it starts to make no sense. So the design is predicated on a 1920 pixel screen size maximum. There are devices which we're going to go to in later videos that adjusts that maximum width down and down and down so that you can view it on mobile phones. So we're setting the page size of 100% of the viewer's device, provided that the viewer's device is no bigger than 1920. We've got a margin here. There is no margin on it. Auto. I'll come back to what that means later on. So that's defined the size of the page. The next thing here says header. You'll notice these little dots at the beginning. A dot in CSS world means that this is a div class. Don't worry about that at the moment. These things become obvious a bit later on. This is a div class. When we go to the actual HTML page, you can see that we actually use the word div class. So in the CSS we just say dot wrapper, and in the HTML we say div class. So now we have a header that's been put in here, which I did earlier. Let's go and put that in. Little space, div class equals, can't type, header, close the div, and this version of the text editor closes the div for me. So we've opened a header and closed a header. By common consent, in the same way that wrapper is a word that's universally used, sometimes the word wrap is used instead. By common consent, the band at the top of the website is usually called the header. You can call it anything you like. Header is not a tag that has special meaning. It's just using convention. So now, what should we do with the header? Well, I've written in the CSS that it's 100% wide, because headers always are the full size of the website. I've said it's going to float left, I'll explain that in a moment, and it's got a background of yellow. Inside the header, I'm going to put a heading, and let's call it Joe Blogs. Let's have a look now at the browser and see what that gives us. And there we are. You can see the two words Joe Blogs, and you can see the background yellow, which is as specified. If I add a height to the header div, let's say height 100 pics, and we go back to it, you can see that it's now got a height of 100 pics. So in this version of HTML, and there are one or two that vary, the size of the div, or the depth of the div I should say, the depth or the height of the div, depending on how you want to think of it. Let's say the height. The height of the div is defined by its content. Very rarely do we give the div an actual height, not impossible, but very rarely, because we'll let the content, however many words or images are in that div, that will cause the div to expand to take into account what's inside it. So I'm going to go back now and look at the next part of the div, the next part of the page. So we've got the header there. The next div along, which is div class title, has a width of 50%, it floats left, and it has a background white. So let's put that in. We've closed the div. And this div is going to be div class equals title. Close the div. Let's give this an H2 title. And we'll just say this is a div. Save that. Have a look at it. And we now have that. So far so good. What you write in the CSS appears on the browser. So that's not too difficult, is it? The thing that I have always done, because I'm using a really bare bones browser, if I'm unsure as to the size of the div that I've designed, I give it a colour temporarily. Let's give it a colour of aqua. And there we go. It said in the CSS that it's a 50% wide, and it also says it's got a margin here. So now let me explain the margins. Think of a clock. At midday, which is the first digit, it has a 2%. So it's got a 2% margin at the top of the clock. On the right hand side at 1/4 it's got 0. At 6 o'clock at the bottom it's got another 2%, so top 2%, bottom 2%. At 1/4, the hour, it's got a 4%, so the left margin is 4%. And as such, we have this. There's the margin at the top. There is a margin at the bottom, though you can't see it. There is no margin on that side. And there's a 4% margin there. So it's time, I guess, to explain some of the technicalities. Now we've established how basically easy it is. We're using floated divs. Imagine, let's go back to the website. Imagine you're building a brick wall, except in this case, you're building it upside down. You're floating bricks in from the top, and the foundations you're going to put in at the very end. So we've floated a header brick in, and there it is, the yellow brick. And now we've floated a brick in below it, and that's the aqua div. You can identify the colours. You can set the colours either by words or, and this is the proper way of doing it, you can do it with a hex colour. I'm going to talk about hex colours later. That happens to be the hex colour for a very light grey. The reason for hex colours is that there is an almost infinite number of hex colours, whereas there is a limit to how many words you can use. You've got yellow, red, black, blue, green, but these are just the primary colours. What happens if you want a bluey green? That's when you have to use a hex colour to define that. So I'm going to take off for a moment that aqua div just to show you the next moves. So we'll take off the title div there. And again, if we go back to the CSS, I have a div class, there's the dot, and it's D-50L. So the next thing is this. When you're identifying a div, you have to begin with a letter. You can't begin with a number. You can't just say what dot 105. So I've chosen a number, I've chosen a letter at random, just D for div. This is the kind of system that I use. You will invent your own system as you go along. So I've called this D-50. That tells me it's a div, it tells me it's 50%, and the L tells me it's the left hand side div. So let's put that in and see what happens. Okay, so we have a light grey div with a black border around it. Let's see how that was created. I should point out that this is how I learned to use HTML. I'm afraid I'm one of those guys, like all men, I don't read the instructions. So I just sort of looked at websites and reverse engineered it and struggled along that way. I'm afraid I was the same at school. I couldn't learn anything unless I saw how it worked. So the D50L has a width of 40%. It floats left. All these divs are going to be floated. You'll see there's a float right. You can float right and you can float left. 90% are floated left, 95% floated left. The margin of this div, again thinking of the clock, no margin at the top, and you can see that because it's banged straight up against the yellow div. No margin at the top. 1% on the right hand side, 2% at the bottom, 2% on the left hand side. The background is that hash E3, 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 which is light grey. Now we've introduced another command tag, border, and the border is 1 pix thick. This colour, hash 000, is the shorthand for black. The full command is 6 zeros. It would be 000 000. But you'll see here that the grey colour has 6 instructions. The black you can get by just giving it the first 3. You can put 6 in if you want, but 3 is to save typing. And the border is solid. So the border command consists of all of that. Border, colon, thickness, colour, the line is solid, semicolon to end that command. I've talked about margins, which is the space above and around the div. I've now introduced the concept of padding. This is padding inside the div. I'll give you an example. Let's write in that. Let's put a P in there, and I'm going to explain these tags in a moment. This is the 50% left div. I'm doing a full stop. Save that. Go and have a look at it. So if you look at the yellow div, you can see that the words Joe Blogs is smashed up against the left side of the screen and the top. There is no space there. I've created space inside the div by using the padding command. And the padding, to remind you, is %2 at the top and the bottom and 3% at either side. Let me clarify that. When I was talking about margins, I said think of a clock. Top, right, bottom, left. The shorthand for that, because the padding could have had the same 4 digits, I've only used 2 digits here. So the first digit, where it says 2%, that means 2% at the top and the bottom. And the 3% means 3% on both sides, the left and the right. So again, I've saved typing time. I could have written 2%, 3%, 2%, 3%, but you don't have to. So we've now covered the basic divs which float into position. We've talked about margin. We've talked about, in an outline, we've talked about background colours. Let's just carry on for a moment. There's another div here which is the div 50R, and the R stands for right in my terminology. Again, you can call these things whatever you like. There are certain keywords that have definite meaning, and you have to be careful with those. But nothing here is. I'm going to copy this if it will copy. There we go. Copy. Paste. Close the div. That P should be up there really. Got it. Now let's have a look at that. and as you can see, entirely different. Let's compare why this is so. Compare and contrast, as they used to say at school. It has a width of 49%. It floats left. It has a background of blue. It has a margin left, and that's all it's got. Let's go back to this thing about margins and clocks. If you can either set the margin in terms of 4 parts of the clock or 4 parts of the compass, or you can set the margin in terms of just the up and down and the left and right, or you can set the margin and the padding with words. You can have margin left, margin right, margin top, margin bottom, and you can do the same with padding. Padding left, padding right, and so on. So that there is the margin specified by the left-hand div, and that little space there is the margin specified by the right-hand div. So we now have 3 floated divs. Let me just show you what happens when you make a mistake, because that's how you learn. This div 50 right, instead of 49%, let's make it 69%. And now, as you can see, it's floated itself somewhere else. It's too big to fit into the right-hand side space. So it's moved itself out. And that's one of the advantages of floated divs. They will sort of set themselves accordingly. Right, let's talk about a few other things. I'm going to change that back to 49. We've talked about div style, which is dot something or other. We've talked about margins. We've said it's all floated left. We've talked about the background command in general figures, the margin command, the padding command, the border command. I haven't mentioned the text size commands. When I put in Joe Blogs, I specified font family, font-family equals play. And then I said it's a sans serif. So let's just deal with that first. I'm going to go back into the top head that I said we wouldn't discuss. Down here there is a link, and the link is to fonts.googleapolist.com, and it says font family play. I'm going to discuss all of that in a different video, but that is a link to Google, and Google have a library of fonts. I like play because it's a little bit modern. So the design and the style of the H1 is play, and it's referenced to a link on a Google website. Where it says sans serif, I'm going to come to sans serif in a little while. Sans serif is just a way of telling the browser that if by some chance it can't find the play font style, then it goes for a font style that looks quite modern. And we'll come back to that. Then I set the font size at 300%. And you can see here that I've used a percent size for the font. I've used a percent size for the widths, but I've used a pixel size for the height, and I've used a pixel size for the border thickness. As you will see in later videos, sometimes it's easier to use percentage and sometimes it's easier to use pixels, and sometimes you have to use pixels. I could just as easily, instead of saying font size 300%, I could have used a pixel size of something like, oh, I don't know, 40 pixels. That would look broadly similar to 300%. It's big, as you'd expect from a heading. The color is black. I could just as easily have said hex 000, and indeed I have there. So that's H1. There are 6 H tags for heading text as opposed to body text. And although I've just said there are 6, you can tweak things so there are an infinite number. But let's just stick with the notion that there are 6, H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. And again, logically, you make the H1 your main header on the page, and as you go down subheading, 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 you resort to H2s and H3s. And I followed that convention because the H1 is a height of 300% and the H2 is a height of 180%. Then we get down to the body size. The P stands for paragraph. There is a reason why they couldn't use the B, because the tag is allocated elsewhere. So the body text, the paragraph text, again, is font family is a play, sans serif. The font size is 110%. Usually, on most websites, they just go for 100%. I find 100% is a little bit small to read sometimes, and I just like to make it a little bit bigger. But that's personal choice. I do struggle with the text size on some of these websites. But that's perhaps because I'm getting old. The colour of the text, again, is black. Now this time, here's another command, another tag command. The line height. The line height is the space between subsequent lines. The normal line height is 100%, but very rarely is 100% used because it's very squashed up and it's difficult to read. Most websites will start at 120%, and when you get down to mobile phone screens, they go up to 140 or 160% for line height. You only really need to put line height on if you're writing a paragraph. If it's a single line, the line height doesn't matter. I've said here text justify. There are 4 text commands for alignment. Text align left, and because the standard, the assumption, the default is left, you don't have to say it. I haven't said text align left on this or that because the system will assume it. If I wanted the text to align to the right, I would have to say text align right. I can also text align center, so everything will line up in the center. Let me just take a paragraph to show you. I've put here another div, a div class D701. Again, it's the way I number things. 701, I know in my head, is a 70% div. Sometimes I put D70, sometimes I put 701, and that's because I like to have, this sounds strange, but I like to have different size 70% divs. That sentence will make sense later on. Back to this. Right. D701 is a width of 70%. A float left again. And here's that margin, 4% at the top and the bottom and 15% at either side. So 15% at either side totals 30%, 2 times 15, 30% and 70% gives you 100%. So this div it blocks out the full width of the page, but the visible part is only 70% and the invisible part, the margins, are 15% either side. So that is my div 701. Let's go back to that. And that's that. I've opened it and I've closed it. We'll ignore that image for a moment because I'm talking about body text. Here is the body text in that div. And to remind you, I've said that the P's are always, on this website, justified. You wouldn't normally do that, but that's the way we're going to start off. We'll look at what that justify command looks like. I kind of wasn't expecting that, so I've made a mistake. Let's quickly check on that. What has obviously happened here, like I say, the best way to learn is to make mistakes. I set this right hand div at 40 something%, and now I've just said I want a 70% div, but the 70% div is peeled into the 50% div, which means I've made a mistake. And the mistake I've made is I didn't close the div because I didn't put the forward slash in. There we go. That will make a difference, I hope. There we go. So we have the justified text, nice straight lines. And so now I'll talk about this image. Let's look at what the text for this says. This is the image command. It begins with, everything is in a triangular bracket, image, alt, two different words. Alt means an alternative piece of text to describe to people with vision problems. But it's worth putting in because most of the search engines will read that. The image alt is blue sea and sky. So the only people that, if the person looking at the website has an audio reader set up, then if the person is blind, the audio reader will read out the text out loud to them. So that would read blue sea and sky, and at the same time the search engine would see that. So there's that little bit there. Next part, and there's a space there. SRC stands for source. SRC. SRC equals, inverted commas, images /c.jpg. So I'll explain that. The picture, which is of the sea, I have put in the images file, which is just a way of keeping things tidy. So if I didn't put the image in a separate file, it would just be src. But I always put the images in one or more folders. C.jpg, we're going to cover image tags later on. JPG stands for joint picture group, I think. 9 out of 10 images are JPGs. There are other suffixes which we won't talk about just now. Then we have this thing, class equals image L. And that is down here. So there's the dot for class. This is just my way of styling it. You can use any set of text or numbers that you want. Obviously, the sensible thing to do is when you're writing some code, give yourself a clue as to what it means when you come to read it months and years later. So this is an image -L. It's a left-sided image. It's got a width of 60%, we know about that. It's floated left, just like the divs, and it has a margin right of 2%. So nothing new there. And that produces that image. So that's an image that is floated to the left, and it occupies 50%, 60% of the available space, which means the text then has to be pushed in the remaining 40%. So the outline of this here is the 70% div, and the image has split the div up. Rather than put two divs in like we did up here, div left and div right, we've broken up the left side and the right hand side by creating an image that is 60% in size, and that means the text has to squash in where it can. I think that is enough for video 1. What I hope I've convinced you of is that this isn't really that difficult. You do have to concentrate, but there's no magic in this. So I look forward to seeing you in video 2 when we reverse engineer a web page that I've already built, and we'll learn about the intricacies in that as we go along and try and keep it interesting. I perhaps just explain at this point, there's a line down here that you can see. There is a command somewhere in this top ribbon, and I did adjust it the other day. That line there is simply an indicator that certain types of code which we are not using should not have too long a line. So don't worry about what that means. If I go into the HTML, you'll see that I've gone past the line. It's just a reminder not to keep going on forever and to break up a sentence. Okay, then I will see you in video 2. Thank you for watching.